All right, welcome to the Talk to Me PDD podcast. I'm your host, PDD. This is my podcast where I talk about leadership, people management, and productivity. Today we have episode 18, where we're going to talk about the books that I read in October 2024. Part of my challenge to myself to read 60 books this year. On pace to do that, fell off a little bit in the past couple months. I've been doing at least 5 a month. October was the first month I only got 4 in. So, I think there's some pros and cons to having this set target for reading. Some ways it's good. It's definitely pushed me to do more and kind of grow my capabilities as a reader. But then sometimes when life happens and other things come up, it's a little bit harder to take a step back or, feel like I'm not holding up my end of the bargain. So definitely felt that way in October and September a little bit as well, kind of bled into that. But again, on pace, up to 50 books at end of the month, and had some really good ones. So I'm excited to share those with you. So the first book I have here is Primal Leadership. Again, this is a book about emotional intelligence for business leaders. This was kind of the book that I was hoping to find last month when I read the emotional intelligence book. That was good as well. I found Primal Leadership a much easier read and more specifically tailored towards emotional intelligence in leadership and management roles. So one of the key concepts that it talks about is this idea of resonance, or sort of the counterpoint to that dissonance, that the way that you behave and communicate emotionally in an organization, especially in a leadership role, does not just end kind of at that communication, but it has ripple effects that last and continue to affect people in the organization beyond kind of an individual interaction or communication. And positive or negatively, that can impact the performance in the organization. So how as a leader can you be aware of that and pick and choose your leadership styles in a way that are going to create that positive resonance, which is going to make the place that you work better for the people there, but it's also going to drive performance by creating a positive environment. So a lot of it is talking about the how that you deliver a message. You can deliver the exact same sort of objective content in a variety of different ways, but being able to tailor it to the audience in a way that's attuned to the emotional state of the people and the environment that you're in, that same message can land with vastly different feelings for those people. So one of the examples in the book was, talking about a company that was going through some cost cutting or had some challenges there. And it was the same objective situation, but two leaders approached it in vastly different ways. And because of that, it landed very differently with the people in the organization, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively. It also talks a bit about how emotions are contagious, this idea of emotional mirroring, which I think I talked a little bit last month in the emotional intelligence book, where we're actually picking up the same physical reactions to the people who are sort of communicating with us and sharing their emotions, and our internal physical state starts to match where they are from an emotional perspective. And even more so for leaders that are communicating in an emotional way, we pick up on that and start to sort of exhibit the same physical and mental state that they're in, and aligning with those through this process of mirroring. Some emotions are more contagious than others, which is good. One of the examples they talk about laughter being very contagious, genuine laughter. If you've ever done an exercise where you look someone in the eye and they smile at you and you try not to smile back, it's very difficult. That sort of someone genuinely smiling at you is a very contagious emotion and hard to resist. So thinking about how the way that we present our emotions, especially as leaders, and how that's going to be picked up by our colleagues and the teams we lead, is something that's important to be aware of. One of the quotes from the book, which I definitely agree with, when people feel good, they work their best. So again, a lot of these things coming back to if you're only concerned with driving performance, this is still the way to go to create a positive emotional environment in which your teams and your organization are working. Um, then it goes into a little bit of some of the um, aspects of emotional intelligence and what that means in kind of this domain. So dividing that up in sort of the personal skills and pieces, and also sort of broader social. So on the personal side, self awareness, being conscious of how you're acting, how you're feeling, the emotional state that you're in, and self management, being able to control your actions and your response to different situations. So that's on the personal side. And then on the broader social side, the social awareness, being aware of the dynamic that you're in, how people are feeling, how various conversations are causing a reaction with others. Um, and also, again, in the social side, relationship management. How do the different dynamics in a given conversation or organization, based on people's relationships to each other, how does that impact the sort of overall experience and emotional state that people are in? Um, Talking about being an empathetic leader, and to summarize how they defined that, which I liked, is just simply taking into account the people's emotions or the person's emotions that you're working with, and being able to communicate and tailor your communication in a way that takes that into account. So sort of going back to that, original example about how a hard message might land, the same exact message can land in very different ways depending on how empathetic you are and how aware you are of the situation and somebody else's sort of emotional state, and being able to understand the reaction to the communication. Um, One of the things that is difficult for leaders, and I think I've talked about this before, is you're not as likely to get objective feedback, especially critical feedback. Likely, the higher you are in an organizational hierarchy, the less and less critical feedback you'll be getting. Um, it's fortunate if you have some, but it may not come as easily as you might want. So going back into that EI personal skill of self awareness, it's something that's incredibly important for leaders, because you may have to be the one who's being self critical and self aware of how your actions are landing, because others may not tell you if you're in a leadership position or higher up in the hierarchy than they are. Um, Sort of related to learning, which I talk a lot about, Primal Leadership is a big proponent of self-directed learning, which I've found to be really the most effective way for myself, and I think it's something that um, we could take more advantage of in organizational life. And they really describe it as understanding sort of a goal for your ideal self, and then having a accurate vision of your real self, where you are, and then using that to chart a learning path or a development path between the two. So going back to that self-awareness, that's a requirement to accurately define what your real self is as you work towards that more idealized version of yourself. Um, One of the things, sort of again along the lines of critical feedback, is it can for leaders, it can sometimes be difficult to get to the truth of a situation, even if it's not kind of something about yourself as a leader. But people may be hesitant to sort of give you bad news, or kind of go into um, the real reason behind why certain things are happening. And that's something that having strong emotional intelligence can help unlock. And obviously, being able to have a truthful view and a realistic view of what's happening is going to enable you to be a better leader. It's difficult to make effective decisions if you don't have an accurate view of what's really going on, or maybe only a partial understanding of the situation. So, if you value sort of really understanding the truth of the situation in your work and in your organization, it's critical to develop these emotional intelligence skills so you can build trust, so people are able to tell you that. Um, Another interesting point is we talk a lot about psychological safety and creating inclusive environment for our teams, but maybe something that's not talked about as much is how leadership itself can be stressful for the people in that role. Um, there's a feeling of sort of being watched and judged from sort of both ends of the hierarchy, maybe from the people you're leading, but also from the people that are more senior from you. So this was, it's interesting to see this in primal leadership and thinking about how, um, emotional intelligence plays into how leaders can manage that stress and feel safe in that environment to be themselves, to lead and to take risks, and to show up as emotionally intelligent leaders. And like I've talked about a number of times, I did another episode on kind of different types of authority. This is again very much aligned with the emotional intelligence approach. You're not just communicating with authority and telling people what to do in every situation. Sometimes you might, and there are some examples where they have leadership techniques that can be used in certain situations that are more authoritarian in their approach, and there's can be a time and a place for that. But for the most part, it's being attuned to how you connect the emotional impact of the work that you're asking teams to do so they can align to it and they can deliver their best work in a positive environment. And last but not least, there was a bit sort of looking at um, emotional intelligence versus sort of traditional intelligence, IQ, and they both have positive impact correlated with higher levels in organizational work, and some of it is domain specific. There are some domains where IQ is going to be particularly important, but in general, they showed in kind of the data and the studies that were presented in this book that an increase in higher emotional intelligence had a proportionately higher impact on business results in general versus IQ. So, and again, something that I talked about in the previous emotional intelligence book. This is an area that you can develop and grow um, much more easily than IQ, which some arguments about it being more fixed. So, taking advantage of the IQ tools that you do have by improving your emotional intelligence. So there you go. I enjoyed that book. Again, if you're looking for an emotional intelligence book for leadership, this would be a good one to start with. Other one was good, but a little bit dense and not as focused on leadership specifically. So there you go. That's the first book. Second book. Here we go. They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us by Hanif Abdurraqib, and did my best with the name there. A note on names is that I really encourage people to try their best to get pronunciation down for names that we're not maybe used to saying. I'm not the best at it, but I try, and I try and help my colleagues there. And I think there's just such a strong kind of identity association associated with our names that for me it's important to try and get it right and try not to ask people, especially in a work context, to go by different names that are maybe easier to pronounce. So yeah, so something that comes to mind there as I struggle to pronounce Hanif's last name there. And he talks a little bit about it in one of his essays in the book. And this is a collection of essays. I was trying to remember where I found this, and there's another book he wrote that I haven't read yet about kids playing basketball, and then I happened to see this. Absolutely love the cover, so I think maybe I got it alone for that. But this is an amazing book of essays. Sort of obsessively about music and culture, but really touching on a lot of different things on race, identity, um, our country in the United States. So he's an amazing writer, very poetic, and I think interesting how sometimes a more poetic style of writing can really capture the feelings of a situation and the reality better than more traditional prose or sort of factual reporting on the situation. So um, yeah, I really enjoyed it. This was kind of a time period where I had checked out a little bit on following music and popular culture. So like 2006 through 2016, something like that 10-year time frame. So good to catch up a little bit on some things that I missed there. Um, Hanif's a really, I think, has a really kind approach to thinking about some really complex problems. And he writes about that sort of being seen as kind as well, which is a complex sort of feedback where, maybe because of certain identities, we kind of only value a kind reaction to very difficult situations. So I say that with sort of some trepidation, but it was something that he talks about as well. Um, but I found his writing a very, human centric approach and a very wise look at some of the challenges that we face. And I feel like, I have a better understanding of sort of, different lived experiences in our country because of reading it, and just really well written. So I would recommend you check that one out. All right, so that was book number 2. Toss it over here. Now we will go on to book number 3, Nobody Cares About Your Career by Erica Ayres Baden. This was great. I really enjoyed this. Talked a lot about career development. There are often things that I've found to be true or thought to be true that maybe not everyone will tell you or won't be written out. So I found a lot of that in this book. Erica was a former CEO of Barstool Sports. She's doing a bunch of Q&A things on LinkedIn now, talking about various career questions. So check her out there. I discovered this when she was on the Best of Both Worlds podcast. I found a lot of really interesting books there. So let me see some things that I took away from that. She talks a lot about navigating the gray, which I think is really valuable. So, you may have sort of various HR related training that you've taken, and will sort of outline situations that may cross policy boundaries or things like that. But in the reality, sometimes there are gray areas there, and how do you navigate that? So that's an area that she digs into in detail in the book. So I appreciated that, because it's not always so easy and so clearly defined, what the right approach is in some of those situations. Um, really, that this nobody cares about your career is nobody cares about your career more than you do or more than you should. So it's up to you. It reminded me a bit of this idea of citizenship, which I talked about in one episode, coming from Peter Block's book, The Answer to How is Yes, that, sometimes we're looking externally for our own development, to our manager, to other resources, and um, really ultimately nobody's going to care more than us about our own development. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Um, and she also talks about finding ways to overcome resistance and having the courage to take on new challenges. And even when we feel like we don't know what we're doing, or we're maybe not necessarily qualified for things. So, if you're feeling some of that imposter syndrome, or maybe held back from feeling like you're ready to go take on something that you want to do, some good motivation to do that there, and kind of talking about how she built her career taking on these roles that, maybe objectively, from a resume perspective, she may not have been qualified for. And I think that's true in many cases. So just having the courage to take on those challenges, and understanding that you'll figure that out, and use that to help grow your career and your experiences to do more and more new things. Her advice to never be satisfied and to always be learning, I think it is apt. I think the never be satisfied can be tough, because we can be really hard on ourselves with that. So I think it's a balance where I try and celebrate accomplishments that I have, but not rest on those laurels. And it's funny. Grew up listening to a lot of underground music and hardcore. There's an album, Satisfaction is the Death of Desire. So that's something that I think about, that you want to keep that desire going and pushing yourself to learn and grow. But at the same time, I think, you do want to recognize accomplishments, but not rest on those. Um, some good advice about accepting accountability when things go wrong. Everyone makes mistakes. Not everything works out. So not blaming others for that, trying to learn from the experience. If you've read Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink, it's I think, similar advice to that, right? Especially in a position of leadership, that even if you maybe feel like there were other factors or other people responsible for a given failure, your role as a leader is to own that and take responsibility for it, to find solutions and to learn and grow from it. Um, she talks a bit about capacity limit, which I think is great. Especially in somebody who's ambitious and driven to move forward in their career. That for everyone, no matter how ambitious and hardworking you are, there's only a certain amount of capacity for work and life that you have at a certain point, and being aware of that, understanding if you're making trade-offs between increasing your capacity at work, maybe you're taking that away from other aspects of life, and maybe that's okay in certain times and places, but just being aware of that trade-off and understanding when you have to say no to things. And I think that goes back to a lot of sort of productivity and planning work where you have to be able to prioritize and work on the highest impact things, and that means saying no to some things. Especially, I think maybe the more successful you get, or more leadership opportunities you have, they're going to be good opportunities, but you just don't have enough capacity to be able to do everything that you might want to do. Um, she also talks about, as a leader, still being willing to get your hands dirty in the day to day work, which I also love. And I think, again, there's a balance with this. You don't want to be a micromanager. You don't want to be into the weeds and the details of things that your team is doing. But at the same time, it's good to have some understanding. It's good to force yourself to to learn and be engaged there. So I like that. That's always something that I've tried to do as much as I can as a leader, as a manager. Not trying to do the work, but trying to understand it and just trying to use that as another way to continue growing and learning, and pushing myself to do things that are new. Um, some kind of general advice that I liked in sort of her career development, and being able to tell your own story, being able to do it in a simple and straightforward way. So, if you're networking or interviewing or just talking to somebody, being able to kind of succinctly get to the point of, what you're about, what you're working on, but also not to do it in a way that is bragging or really over the top, and talking about how that can sometimes be very transparent if someone is trying to present themselves in a way that seems, maybe beyond what's realistic or beyond what's modest. So, some good advice there as well. Um, and the last piece, which I really liked because I've talked about it and I haven't seen it written in a lot of other places, but talking about this idea of compartmentalization, especially between work and personal life, right? We're one person, something can happen at home, especially if you're in this environment where you're working from home, where you're sort of in both places more or less simultaneously. And how do you um, take that emotional reaction or challenging situation, no matter what direction it could be, coming from work to home or vice versa, and how are you able to kind of hold on to that and be able to go on professionally with the things that you need to do. um, but then I think at some point you do need to unpack and process that. Oftentimes, I've found that if you can hold on to it and compartmentalize it for a little bit, when you do come back to it, it's not necessarily as big of an issue as you might thought it would be. So again, I thought that was great that she included that. I haven't seen it in a lot of development books. So there you go. That's book number 3. Nobody cares about your career. All right. Last but not least, The Coming Wave by Mustafa Suleiman. Again, I mean, not again, but this is a book that I think everybody should read. Sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around everything that people talk about changing with artificial intelligence and other technologies that are sort of emerging now. It seems very sci-fi and unbelievable, some of the scenarios that we hear. Um, so in this book, you get a good understanding of how that may actually be possible in a relatively short period of time, how all of these technologies are sort of coming together at the same time in a way where they're potentially going to accelerate and grow much faster than we can understand conceptually, at least based on past technologies. So I really think it's useful for everyone to read. I did find this book, to be perfectly honest, very verbose, and not in a way that necessarily added to getting the message across. I think maybe if it was a third of the length, it would be a lot more accessible with the same amount of information to a broader audience. So just my opinion there. Obviously, it's doing just fine, selling, and it's a popular book. But I think for people to understand the information in it, it could be a little bit shorter. All right. So the central problem of a lot of these things is how do we contain them? How do we stop them from sort of going off and changing things too quickly or in a direction that is not necessarily where we want to go as humanity? I can't say that I left this book extremely optimistic about our chances for doing that, but there is a path forward that's proposed there. But a lot of things have to happen and coordinate together, and I see some challenges in doing that. So um, hopeful, but not entirely optimistic after reading it. So I did find it a little bit, I don't want to say depressing, but maybe not as optimistic um, a solution as I was hoping to find. So some of the features of what sort of this technological wave exhibits, according to the book. So asymmetric in terms of how these technologies can be used in terms of power. So what an individual user or an individual human could do in maybe the next decade or so with AI, with synthetic biology, some of these other technologies that are emerging, is going to rival what a nation state could do today. So there are obviously some pros to that. It's incredibly empowering for individuals to be able to take their ideas and execute them in ways that they couldn't as an individual person in the past, but also opens up a lot of possibility for catastrophe. If you have one individual person who's bent on a bad action, they now potentially have a lot more power with these technologies to cause a real catastrophe. So that's one, the asymmetric nature of these technologies. Number two, hyper evolution, which was sort of what I alluded to, just the fact that the way that these technologies improve are going to be at a rate that we haven't necessarily seen before, and as they get better, they're sort of increasing that rate. So it's a cycle where the rate of technological advancement is just going to increase with the technology itself. Third is this idea of omni use. So being able to take these technologies and not just use them in one specific domain, but be able to use them very generally and in ways that people have not yet thought of. So again, a lot of power with that, but then also hard to control and hard to understand exactly the impact of a advancement in a particular technology or a combination of things, how they might be put together, and what people are going to be able to do with them in very different domains. Um, and lastly, this idea of autonomy, like, do we need a human? Will there be a human in the loop with some of these things? So that's potentially really where containment is hard, or there's maybe some unchecked growth of these technologies where we're taking ourselves out of the loop, and with AI or other tools being able to sort of self-evolve and potentially grow in directions that we don't really know or we can't check or not entirely sure of the consequences. So anyway, it's a great book. Everybody should read it. I would have liked it to be a third of the length. But there you go. That's it. So only 4 books this month. I feel like I'm back on target for 5 now. We'll see how it goes. But thanks for checking in. Hopefully you'll enjoy some of these, and I'll talk to you next time.